there were some indications that the enemy might be caught with even fewer than the 2 or 3 carriers which combined fleet anticipated might be available in the Hawaiian area to oppose the Japanese invasion of Midway. On the 18th of May, a patrol plane of the South Seas Force had spotted an enemy task force with 2 carriers to the east of the Solomons, which suggested that Hornet and Enterprise had again sortied from Pearl Harbor to operate in the southwest Pacific. This seemed to be confirmed by subsequent radio intelligence, indicating the presence of an enemy carrier force to the south of the Solomons, and also by a reported raid on Tulagi by enemy carrier planes, a short while later. Should this enemy force continue operating in the Solomons area, it appeared likely that the Americans would have virtually no carrier strength available at Hawaii to throw against the Midway invasion force. The invasion would then be easy, but the hope of luring the enemy fleet into decisive battle would be gone. May 20th also saw the departure from Yokosuka and Kura of the transport group carrying the Army and Navy landing forces for Midway. The transports headed for the assembly point at Saipan, where they arrived on the 24th of May. Rear Admiral Takeo Kurita's support force of heavy cruisers simultaneously arriving at nearby Guam in preparation for covering the advance of the invasion convoy on Midway. Various units of Vice Admiral Hosogaya's northern force likewise began moving out of the western inland sea after the 20th, heading for Ominato, the staging point for the Aleutians' invasion. Slowly the massive battle forces were getting into motion. Forces which were to proceed direct from the inland sea to the battle area still had a week to wait. Admiral Yamamoto decided not to let this time go to waste, and on the 21st of May, the main force, the Kondo Force, and Vice Admiral Nagumo's first carrier striking force went out through Bungo Strait into the open sea, and for 2 days engaged in fleet maneuvers, the biggest undertaken since before the outbreak of war, and the last ever to be staged in the open sea by the Imperial Navy. On the 25th of May, back in Hashirajima anchorage, the Midway and Aleutians operations were once more rehearsed in tabletop maneuvers held on board Yamato. The assembled commanders and staff officers also listened to a detailed report of the Coral Sea battle given by Vice Admiral Takagi, who had commanded the Japanese force in that engagement. Now everything was ready for the big sortie. Force commanders and staff officers assembled at Hashirajima gathered on board Yamato and joined Admiral Yamamoto in toasting the success of the forthcoming operation with cups of sake bestowed by His Majesty the Emperor. The stage was now set for the launching of the Midway operation. At each of the 3 takeoff points Ominato on northern Honshu, Hashirajima in the western inland sea, and Saipan and Guam in the Marianas, the forces were poised and ready to head for their objectives. Rear Admiral Kakuji Kakuta's second carrier striking force, assigned to the Aleutians' prong of the offensive, was the first to sortie. Flying his flag in light carrier Ryujo, Kakuta took his force out of Ominato Harbour at noon on the 26th of May, transited Tsugaru Strait, and set an easterly course across the northern Pacific. Late the same night, the force encountered a dense and seemingly endless fog, which made it difficult to keep formation, since not one of the ships was equipped with radar and strict radio silence was in force. Even so, the fog was not entirely unwelcome, for it lessened the danger of discovery by enemy submarines known to be lurking in the waters east of Hokkaido. For this, the officers and men were grateful, but at the same time they fervently hoped that the fog would be gone by the 4th of June, when the carriers were to launch their strike against Dutch Harbour. The following morning, the 27th of May, saw the departure of the Nagumo force from Hashirajima anchorage. As stated earlier, the 21 ships of the force threaded their way through Bungo Strait at about noon, and by nightfall were well into the Pacific, forging southeastward in circular cruising disposition. There was no indication that we had been discovered by enemy submarines, and I turned in for the night with a comfortable feeling that all was going well. My own luck, however, was not to hold. I had barely dropped off to sleep when I was suddenly awakened by sharp abdominal pains. Commander Tamai, Akagi's chief surgeon, was quickly summoned, and after a careful examination he announced that it was appendicitis, and he would have to operate immediately. This was a hard blow, for it meant that I would be a helpless spectator of the exciting events about to begin. I asked Tamai if he couldn't possibly treat me so that I could keep going for another 10 days without an operation, but he was adamant. Commander Gender joined in, urging me to follow the surgeon's advice. The appendectomy was performed that night as Akagi sped on her way, and I awoke early the next afternoon in the ship's sick bay to find the sharp pain of the night, before reduced to a dull ache, the aftermath of Tamai's surgery. A corpsman who came in to see how I was getting on told me that our noon position had been 430 miles south of Tokyo, and that we were now headed east. Meanwhile, the other forces were also sortying according to plan. From Ominato, Vice Admiral Hosogaya's Northern Force main body and the Attu and Kiska invasion forces departed on the 28th. Far to the south, the transports carrying the Midway landing forces, escorted by Rear Admiral Tanaka's light cruiser flagship, Jintsu, and 12 destroyers, together with seaplane carrier Chitose, tender Kamikawa Maru and other units, sortied from Saipan during that same evening. In order to deceive any enemy submarines that might be lurking in the vicinity, the invasion convoy first took a westerly course and skirted around to the south of Tinian before heading eastward. Rear Admiral Kurita's support group of heavy cruisers sorted almost simultaneously from Guam and took a parallel course about 40 miles to the southwest of the invasion convoy. Last to sortie were the main body of the Midway invasion force under Vice Admiral Kondo and the main force under direct command of Admiral Yamamoto. Kondo's ships began moving out of Hashirajima during the early morning of the 29th of May, light cruiser Yura and 7 destroyers of Destroyer Squadron 4 leading the way. Followed by cruiser divisions 4, Atago, Chokai and 5, Myoko, Haguro, Battleship Division 3, less its second section, Hiei, Kongo, light carrier Zuiho and 1 destroyer. Admiral Kondo flew his flag in heavy cruiser Atago. After passing through Bungo Strait, the force headed eastward. Admiral Yamamoto's main force of 32 ships sorted on the heels of the Kondo force. Light cruiser Sendai and 20 destroyers under Commander Destroyer Squadron 3. Rear Admiral Shintaro Hashimoto were in the van, followed by Cruiser Division 9, light cruisers Kitakami and Oi under Rear Admiral Fukuji Kishi, Battleship Division 1, Yamato, Nagato, Mutsu directly under Admiral Yamamoto, and Battleship Division 2, Ise, Hyuga, Fuso, Yamashiro, under Vice Admiral Takasu. Light carrier Hosho and 1 destroyer brought up the rear. It was 5 months since the battleship group had last sorted from home waters. Throughout the first phase operations in the southern area, it had remained in the inland sea training rigorously for what it hoped would be a major role in the anticipated decisive battle against the American fleet. The officers and men of the big battle wagons were still confident that their massive firepower would win the battle when it came. Now, at last, it looked as if they were going to have their chance to prove it, and the morale of the crews was high. The strength of the force was greater than ever by reason of the addition of Yamato, armed with the heaviest guns afloat, now making her maiden sortie. As the main force headed for Bungo Strait, destroyers patrolling outside the strait suddenly reported sighting 2 enemy submarines. Radio intelligence had also reported a total of 6 enemy submarines operating in waters close to the homeland, and 4 more operating to the northeast of Wake Island. Anti-submarine operations by surface units and planes from Kura Naval Base were immediately intensified, and all ships of the Kondo and Yamamoto forces were ordered to proceed under strict anti-submarine alert. Both forces passed through the danger area happily without mishap. After reaching the open sea, the main force shifted its cruising disposition, the battleships forming 2 parallel columns with Yamato, Nagato and Mutsu on the right, and Ise, Hyuga, Fuso and Yamashiro on the left. Between the 2 columns, light carrier Hosho took position and engaged in launching and recovering anti-submarine patrol planes. Light cruiser Sendai and 20 destroyers formed a circular screen around the battleship group at a distance of 1,500 meters. Light cruisers Kitakami and Oi were stationed on the rear flanks, 10,000 meters apart, to guard against tracking enemy submarines. The force proceeded southeast at a speed of 18 knots, zigzagging at intervals of 5 to 10 minutes. As I lay in Akagi's sick bay convalescing from the operation I had undergone on the night of our sortie, my thoughts naturally centered on the momentous operation in which our fleet was engaged. I thought especially of the heavy burden of responsibility resting on the shoulders of our own commander, Admiral Nagumo, whose force was spearheading the attack. Would he measure up to this responsibility? My first acquaintance with Admiral Nagumo dated back to 1933. I was then a lieutenant and chief flying officer of heavy cruiser Maya, assigned to Cruiser Division 4, 2nd Fleet. Besides Maya, the division comprised flagship Chokai, Takao, and Atago, Japan's newest heavy cruisers. Nagumo, then a captain, was commanding officer of Takao. My duties brought me into frequent contact with Captain Nagumo, a capable, intelligent, and energetic officer who was rated high among the many able captains in the fleet. He belonged to what Navy officers called the Red Brick Group. This meant that he had already served a tour of duty in the Navy Ministry. The curious designation coming from the fact that the Navy Ministry building was made of red brick. He had also served in the Naval General Staff, on the staff of Combined Fleet, and as an instructor at the Naval War College. His command of a heavy cruiser followed the normal course of promotion to flag rank. He would get a battleship the following year, and eventually would become a fleet commander. In the Combined Fleet tactical organization prevailing at that time, the 2nd Fleet constituted the advance force. Consequently, the emphasis in our training was primarily on torpedo attacks and night engagements. Captain Nagumo, an expert in torpedo warfare, was the right man in the right place. As a junior officer whose job was simply to fly planes, I looked up to him with a feeling of awe and admiration because of the outstanding way he discharged his exacting duties. Every aspect of his leadership impressed me. His speeches at maneuver conferences were always logical and enlightening, and one could not help respecting his extraordinary ability. Candid, yet open-hearted and considerate, he was always willing to assist the younger officers. We held him in high esteem and placed complete confidence in him. At this time, sentiment in favor of abrogating the Washington Naval Limitation Treaty was rapidly mounting in the Navy. In our eyes, the attitude of the central authorities seemed weak-kneed, and Captain Nagumo was leading an active movement against it. He busily visited the commanding officers of other ships and urged them to join in pressing for early abrogation of the treaty. As a result of his efforts, a recommendation was drafted, and after being signed by many officers, was forwarded to the central authorities through fleet headquarters as representing the opinion of the fleet. This particularly pleased the young officers who always favoured a firm policy, whatever it might be. My impressions of Captain Nagumo at that time convinced me that he would be a great naval leader. Our paths did not cross again until 1941, by which time Nagumo had risen to Vice Admiral in command of 1st Air Fleet. I was assigned as a wing leader on carrier Akagi. In the intervening years, Nagumo's reputation had continued to rise, especially during his command of Destroyer Squadron 1 as a rear admiral. Serving under him again revived my memories of 7 years earlier, and I was happy to be a member of his command. It was not long, however, before I noted that Nagumo had changed, and I began to feel dissatisfied with his apparent conservatism and passiveness. It might have been because he was now commanding an air arm, which was not his specialty. Personally, he was as warm-hearted and sympathetic as ever, but his once vigorous fighting spirit seemed to be gone, and with it his stature as an outstanding naval leader. Instead, he seemed rather average, and I was suddenly aware of his increased age. In directing operations, he no longer seemed to take the initiative, and when plans were being developed, he most often merely approved the recommendations of his staff. Commander Gender, his operations officer, once summed up the situation to me in these words: "Whenever I draft a plan, it is approved almost without consideration. This might appear to make my job easier, but it doesn't. On the contrary, it is disquieting to see my own plans approved without any check from above, and then issued as formal orders. I am self-confident, but not so self-confident that I don't realize that anyone can make mistakes. Often I am puzzled over how to resolve an important problem. When I consider that a stroke of my pen might sway the destiny of the nation, it almost paralyzes me with fear. If I were serving under a commander like Admiral Onishi or Admiral Yamaguchi, my plans would be thoroughly studied from every possible angle and returned to me with comments and opinions. I would then feel more sure and more free to propose ideas that might be extreme. I understood exactly what gender meant and was in complete sympathy with him. Unfortunately, such passiveness was not peculiar to Nagumo alone. It was a common failing in the Japanese Navy. Fleet commanders generally were inclined to leave all details to their staffs and content themselves with controlling only the broad outline of affairs. Thus, the personality of the commander was rarely reflected in the execution of operations. This tendency to rely excessively on the staff was promoted by the fact that, under the Japanese Navy system, officers whose seniority put them in line for a fleet command were often given one for which their special qualifications did not suit them. The appointment of Nagumo, whose specialty was torpedo warfare, to command the 1st Air Fleet was an example. A commander's shortcomings in special fields were supposed to be compensated for by the specialists on his staff. The result was that the influence of the staff officers naturally became very great. This did not mean, however, that staff officers trespassed on the authority of their superiors. Final responsibility for an operation always rested with the commander, and every action was presumed to have been taken by his decision. Indeed, Nagumo, passive though he was, did not always leave everything to his subordinates. There were occasions when he disregarded their advice and chose his own course of action. The end of the 29th of May found the various Japanese forces forging ahead toward their objectives without any hitch other than the fog still plaguing the Kakuta force. On the 30th, however, the weather also began to deteriorate over that part of the Central Pacific, now being traversed by the Yamamoto and Kondo forces. In the afternoon, the Yamamoto force encountered rain and increasingly strong winds, which caused the destroyers and cruisers to ship occasional seas over their bows, making navigation difficult. The formation cut its speed to 14 knots, and zigzagging was discontinued. It was not only the weather that was ominous. Yamato's radio crew, which was keeping a close watch on enemy communications traffic, intercepted a long urgent message sent by an enemy submarine from a position directly ahead of the Japanese transport group. The message was addressed to Midway. It was in code, and we could not decipher it, but it suggested the possibility that the transport group had been discovered. If so, it would be logical for the enemy to surmise that the transports were almost certainly heading for Midway to attempt an invasion. Since so large a convoy sailing east-northeast from Saipan could hardly be taken as merely a supply force going to Wake Island. Admiral Yamamoto's staff officers, however, were not greatly concerned. They nonchalantly took the view that if the enemy had guessed our purpose and now sent his fleet out to oppose the invasion, the primary Japanese objective of drawing out the enemy forces to be destroyed in decisive battle would be achieved. Bad weather continued in the Central Pacific on the 31st of May. Not only the Yamamoto and Kondo forces, but also Vice Admiral Nagumo's carriers, which were a few hundred miles farther east, encountered strong winds and occasional rain. Meanwhile, Yamato's radio intelligence unit observed further signs of enemy activity, especially of aircraft and submarines, in both the Hawaii and Aleutian's vicinities. Admiral Yamamoto and his staff surmised that the activity around Hawaii might presage a sortie by an enemy task force, and they waited eagerly for reports of the flying boat reconnaissance, which was to have been carried out over Hawaii on this date. The two Type 2 flying boats assigned to this mission, designated the second Operation K, had duly moved up to Wotya, and were scheduled to take off at 12 a.m. May 30th, Tokyo time to reach French frigate Shoals by 2:30 p.m., 5:30 p.m. local time shortly before sunset, refuel there from submarines and take off within an hour and a half for Hawaii. If all went well, they would arrive over Hawaii at 8:45 p.m., 1:15 a.m. May 31st local time. After completing their reconnaissance, they would fly non-stop back to Wotya, reaching there about 9:20 a.m. Tokyo time on the 1st of June. Vice Admiral Komatsu, Commander Submarine Force, had assigned 6 submarines to the operation. 3 of them were to refuel the flying boats at French frigate Shoals. Another was to take station on a line between Wotya and French frigate Shoals, about 550 miles from the latter, to serve as a radio picket ship. The 5th was to lie off Kearhole Point, on the island of Hawaii, as a rescue boat in case of mishap, and the 6th was to be stationed 80 miles southwest of Oahu for patrol and weather observation. The carefully laid plan, however, had already gone awry. On the 30th of May, I-123, one of the fueling subs, reached French frigate Shoals and, to its dismay, found 2 enemy ships lying at anchor. It urgently radioed this information back to WWII, adding that there appeared to be little prospect of carrying out the refueling operation at the Shoals as planned. Vice Admiral Goto, 24th Air Flotilla commander at WWII, who was responsible for directing the second Operation K, accordingly ordered a 24-hour postponement, instructing I-123 to keep watching the shoals in the hope that the enemy ships would depart. This forlorn hope was blasted the following day when I-123 reported that she had sighted 2 enemy flying boats near the entrance to the shoals. This made it apparent that the enemy was already using the shoals as a seaplane base, and there consequently was no alternative to complete abandonment of Operation K. These disappointing developments were promptly communicated to Admiral Yamamoto in Yamato. The failure of Operation K meant that there was no way of ascertaining what enemy strength actually was present at Pearl Harbor. Nevertheless, Combined Fleet Headquarters still hoped that, if an enemy force did sortie from that base, to oppose the Midway invasion. The submarine cordons, scheduled to be established by Vice Admiral Komatsu's command between Hawaii and Midway by the 2nd of June, would suffice to provide advance warning, as well as knowledge of the enemy's strength. The 1st of June found the Yamamoto force still surrounded by dark, forbidding weather, although the rain had ceased. Low-lying clouds made visibility so poor that it was barely possible from Yamato's bridge to make out the phantom shapes of the destroyer screen 1,500 meters away. It was now time for the main force to rendezvous with its tanker train and refuel. The oilers were not found at the pre-arranged rendezvous point, however, and Hosho launched planes to look for them. The search proved unsuccessful because of poor visibility, but at this point the tanker train radioed its position to Yamato, making it possible to effect a rendezvous. At the same time, because radio silence had been broken, it had to be assumed that the enemy was now aware of the position of the main force. Evidence that the enemy had already discovered, or at the very least, strongly suspected the Japanese advance toward Midway mounted sharply during the day. Radio intelligence disclosed a marked intensification of communications traffic out of Hawaii, and 72 out of 180 intercepted messages were urgent, indicating an unusually tense situation. A chance encounter 500 miles north-northeast of WWII between a Japanese patrol plane from that island and an American flying boat, which exchanged brief machine gun bursts, also showed that the enemy had extended his Midway-based air patrols out to a radius of 700 miles. There were still further reports to the effect that enemy submarines had been sighted about 500 miles northeast and north-northeast of Wake Island, which almost certainly indicated the existence of an American submarine patrol line some 600 miles southwest of Midway. By this time, the Midway transport convoy had reached a point about 1,000 miles to the west of Midway and was proceeding on a northeast course. Advancing at a rate of 240 miles in 24 hours, the convoy would enter the 700-mile patrol radius of American planes from Midway on the 3rd of June, 2 days before the date set for the pre-invasion airstrike on the island by the Nagumo force. It looked as if the transports were advancing too fast for their own safety. Cloudy weather, with occasional rain, persisted in the vicinity of the Yamamoto force on the 2nd of June. Fueling operations, which had started the preceding day after the delayed rendezvous with the tankers, were resumed in the morning but had to be discontinued again when visibility became so poor that the ships could no longer maneuver safely. Still another hitch now developed in the operation plan. Owing to overhaul delays which had postponed their departure from the homeland, the submarines of Squadron 5 assigned to the B cordon line scheduled to be established on the 2nd of June to the northwest of Hawaii failed to reach their assigned positions. Boats of Submarine Squadron 3 assigned to the A cordon line to the west of Hawaii were also unable to reach their stations because of delays resulting from the miscarriage of Operation K. Actually, it was not until the 4th of June that the submarines arrived on station. With the submarine cordons not yet established, Admiral Yamamoto and his staff remained completely in the dark regarding enemy task force activities. During the 2nd of June, however, submarine I-168, reconnoitering the Midway area, sent in a few bits of information regarding the situation there. The report stated that no ships had been observed other than a picket ship south of Sand Island, that the enemy appeared to be flying intensive air patrols to the southwest, probably to a distance of 600 miles, that a strict alert seemed to be in force, with numerous aircraft on defensive patrol day and night, and that many construction cranes were visible on the island, suggesting that installations were being expanded. This turned out to be the only significant reconnaissance report sent in by a submarine during the Midway operation, despite the great reliance placed on them by combined fleet headquarters. During the 2nd, the Nagumo force, cruising some 600 miles ahead of the Yamamoto force, entered an area enveloped in thick mist. Clouds hovered low over the ocean, and light rain began to fall. Fog seemed likely to follow. Already visibility was so restricted that neighbouring ships in the formation could scarcely see each other. Vice Admiral Nagumo in flagship Akagi was as much in the dark about enemy fleet movements and intentions as combined fleet headquarters. Indeed, because of Akagi's limited radio receiving capacity, coupled with the radio silence being observed by the advancing Japanese forces, he lacked much of the information which had been received by Admiral Yamamoto in the fleet flagship, and which strongly suggested that the enemy was already aware or highly suspicious of a Japanese advance toward Midway and was preparing to counter it. This was precisely the situation which Rear Admiral Kusaka, Nagumo Force Chief of Staff, had feared might develop. Prior to the sortie, he had repeatedly requested that Yamato relay all important radio intelligence information to Akagi, but it was apparent that Admiral Yamamoto and his staff still hoped that surprise had not been lost and felt it advisable to continue radio silence. Thus, as the 2nd of June ended, the Japanese forces were steadily approaching their objectives through adverse weather. Thus far there was no certain indication that any of them had actually been detected by the enemy, and every man from Commander-in-Chief Combined Fleet on down hoped that the precious advantage of surprise was still in Japanese hands. By dawn on the 3rd of June, the mist which the Nagumo force had encountered the previous afternoon had become a heavy blanket of fog. Steaming at fog navigation quarters, adjoining ships in the formation were often unable to see each other across their scant 600-yard intervals. Powerful searchlights were turned on, but they scarcely showed through the gloom. The task of maintaining zigzag courses through this endless veil, with only momentary and infrequent glimpses of consorting ships, was arduous and nerve-wracking. Yet it had to be done, for we were entering waters patrolled by enemy submarines. While the fog was advantageous in keeping us hidden from prying scout planes, this benefit was cancelled by the increased hazards of navigation. Moreover, the fog would not hamper the enemy's radar-equipped submarines, yet it prevented us from launching anti-submarine patrol planes. To cope with these and other problems that beset us, all ships were at full alert, and double watches were posted at submarine lookout stations. The starboard side of Akagi's bridge was occupied by Admiral Nagumo and his entire staff. They stared silently at the impenetrable curtain surrounding the ship, and each face was tense with anxiety. Captain Aoki and his navigation officer, Commander Miura, on the other side of the bridge, devoted their entire energies to keeping the ship on course and maintaining position in the formation. From time to time they leaned out of the window in an effort to peer through the all-encompassing fog. Captain Aoki and his navigation officer, Commander Miura, on the other side of the bridge, devoted their entire energies to keeping the ship on course and maintaining position in the formation. From time to time they leaned out of the window in an effort to peer through the all-encompassing fog. A change in course was scheduled for 10:30 a.m., and it had to be executed if our timetable was to be carried out. Yet, prior to execution of such a course change in heavy fog, confirmation would have to be communicated to all ships in the formation, lest some stray and become lost. With visibility so limited, flag signals obviously could not be employed, and even searchlights would be ineffective to transmit the required orders. Nothing remained but to use radio, which was sure to reveal our presence and position to the enemy, a matter of deep concern to Admiral Nagumo and his staff. This distressing situation served to bring out the fact that Nagumo had been assigned 2 tactical missions, which were essentially incompatible. The assignment to attack Midway on the 5th of June in preparation for the landing operation put his force under rigid limitations of movement. The other mission to contact and destroy enemy naval forces required that Nagumo be entirely free to move as the situation required, and it also made it absolutely essential to keep our whereabouts secret while searching for the enemy. A decision obviously had to be made as to which of these missions should be given precedence. Nagumo's staff had pondered this problem hypothetically for a long time, but now the task force commander faced a situation requiring a definitive choice, and still there was not a scrap of information about enemy naval forces. In this critical situation, the senior member of the staff, Captain Oishi, was the first to speak up. The Combined Fleet Operation Order gives first priority to the destruction of enemy forces. Cooperation with the landing operation is secondary, but the same order specifically calls for our air attack on Midway Island on the 5th of June. This means that the air attack must be carried out exactly as scheduled, provided that no enemy task forces are located by the time we are ready to launch. If we do not neutralize the Midway-based air forces as planned, our landing operations 2 days later will be strongly opposed, and the entire invasion schedule will be upset. With his usual directness, Admiral Nagumo voiced the question in everyone's mind, but where is the enemy fleet? In answer, Oishi continued, "We know nothing of the enemy's whereabouts because we failed to reconnoiter Pearl Harbor. But if his forces are now in Pearl Harbor, we shall have plenty of time to prepare to meet them should they sortie following our strike at Midway. They will have over 1,100 miles to cover. Even if they are already aware of our movements and have sortied to meet us, they cannot be far out from base at this moment, and certainly can't be near us. I think, therefore, that the first thing for us to do is to carry out the scheduled raid on Midway." At this, Chief of Staff Kusaka turned to the intelligence officer and asked if radio intercepts had given any indication of enemy movements. Informed that nothing had been picked up, Kusaka asked if any information had been received from Combined Fleet flagship Yamato. Receiving another negative response, he addressed a suggestion to Admiral Nagumo. "Since we must maintain the schedule at all cost, would you approve the use of our low-powered interfleet radio for sending the order to change course?" The commander assented to this as the only feasible solution, and the order was sent accordingly by medium-wave transmitter. A reduced power transmission would reach out to the fringe of our force and, it was hoped, not farther. This method was not entirely safe, but it had worked on occasion in the past, thanks to enemy carelessness. In this case, however, the message was received clearly even by Yamato, which was 600 miles to the rear. Inasmuch as an enemy task force was then only a few hundred miles distant, a fact of which we were totally unaware, it was highly probable that it, too, intercepted this signal. From the first, the planners of the Midway operation calculated that the enemy naval forces would be lured out by the strike on Midway Island and not before. We had not the slightest idea that the enemy had already sortied, much less that a powerful enemy force was lying in wait, ready to pounce upon us at any moment. Dense fog still hung over the Nagumo force throughout the afternoon and on into the night. In contrast to the tenseness prevailing on Akagi's bridge, her wardroom hummed with the lusty chatter and laughter of carefree flyers, whose only job was to jump into their planes and roar off at a moment's notice. Everything was ready for the scheduled air raid 2 days hence, and no flight missions had been ordered because of the adverse weather. The pilots consequently had nothing to do and passed their time playing cards. Meanwhile, the weather around the Yamamoto force, 600 miles astern, improved somewhat in the afternoon, and refueling, which had been suspended on the preceding day, was resumed. The worst thing about the persistent fog was that it cloaked enemy movements in complete secrecy. As previously mentioned, the plan for a flying boat reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor on the 31st of May, using French frigate shoals as a refueling point, had been thwarted. Nor did our submarines provide any information. The sole remaining source of information was radio intelligence. As early as the 30th of May, such intelligence picked up by Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, Yamato had pointed to brisk enemy activity in the Hawaii area, especially of patrol planes. This strongly suggested the possibility of a sortie by an enemy force from the Hawaiian base, but Combined Fleet sent no warning whatever to Admiral Nagumo. Admiral Nagumo and his staff were deeply chagrined when they learned after the battle that because of this radio intelligence Combined Fleet headquarters had suspected an enemy sortie. Why did Combined Fleet not transmit this vital information to the carrier striking force so that any danger of its being taken by surprise might be averted? There were two reasons behind this unfortunate failure. Firstly, Combined Fleet Headquarters thoughtlessly believed that Akagi, closer to the enemy than Yamato, would naturally have obtained the same information, and that Admiral Nagumo was formulating his decisions accordingly. Secondly, they feared that radio communication between the two forces would reveal their positions to the enemy. At any rate, Admiral Yamamoto's failure to issue necessary precautionary instructions to the forces under his command was an important cause of the Midway fiasco. He was to blame for being too much preoccupied with the idea of radio silence. It is easy to imagine what angry and bitter emotions must have welled up in Rear Admiral Kusaka when he went on board Yamato after the battle to report on the near annihilation of the Nagumo force, and there learned for the first time of Combined Fleet's negligence. Well might he have said, "My God, how often I told them not to let this happen, if only they had let us know in time." Combined Fleet Headquarters, however, was not alone to blame. The Naval General Staff back in Tokyo was also partially responsible, for it again sent a radio to Combined Fleet concerning enemy fleet activity in the Solomon Islands area. The message carried the strong implication that the movement of the Japanese forces toward Midway was not yet suspected by the enemy. The Naval General Staff had originally opposed the Midway operation, but once having given its approval, it was responsible for the whole operation even more than was Combined Fleet Headquarters. With the decisive battle only a few days off, it was engaged in gathering all available intelligence regarding enemy activity. What particularly attracted the attention of the intelligence staff was indications that an American carrier task force still was operating in the Solomons area. If this were true, as the Naval General Staff believed, it constituted powerful evidence that the enemy did not yet suspect our intention, for if he did, he would obviously have called all his scarce remaining carriers back from the Southwest Pacific. Even after intercepting a number of urgent calls from American radios in the Hawaii Midway area, the Naval General Staff still stuck fast to its first conclusion. This was perhaps due to the inherent Japanese tendency toward wishful thinking, which permeated our actions throughout the war. The storm of battle was about to break, and for the first time in 6 months, fate did not seem to be smiling upon us. No change, however, was made in the operational plan. All forces plunged onward through the boundless fog like stagecoach horses driven blindly forward by a cracking whip. If Admiral Yamamoto and his staff were vaguely disturbed by the persistent bad weather and by lack of information concerning the doings of the enemy, they would have been truly dismayed had they known the actual enemy situation. Post-war American accounts make it clear that the United States Pacific Fleet knew of the Japanese plan to invade Midway, even before our forces had sortied from home waters. As a result of some amazing achievements by American intelligence, the enemy had succeeded in breaking the principal code then in use by the Japanese Navy. In this way, the enemy was able to learn of our intentions almost as quickly as we had determined them ourselves. In early May, the enemy knew that another major operation was being planned by the Japanese fleet, to be carried out by the end of that month or early in June. The precise objective of this operation was not known at first, but by the middle of May, the enemy had not only learned that the Japanese target was Midway, but also had ascertained with considerable accuracy the makeup of forces to be employed. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief U.S. Pacific Fleet, personally visited the island in early May and took steps toward strengthening the garrison forces and adding to the defense facilities and fortifications. By early June, Midway plane strength had been augmented by the arrival of 16 Marine Corps dive bombers, 7 Wildcat fighters, some 30 Navy patrol flying boats, and 18 B-17 aircraft and 4 B-26 aircraft from the Army. More than 2,000 garrison troops were deployed ashore, and many anti-aircraft batteries were installed. A number of motor torpedo boats were also brought in to be employed for short-range coastal patrol and night attack missions. In addition, 3 submarine patrol arcs were set up at distances of 100, 150 and 200 miles from Midway, with a total of 20 submarines on stations by the 4th of June. The United States Pacific Fleet was determined to oppose the invasion of Midway with all the strength that it could muster. On this point, the calculations of combined fleet had been entirely correct. Midway was so important to the safety of Hawaii that the American fleet could not let it be taken without a battle. Advance knowledge of Japanese intentions was an important advantage, but nevertheless the prospects confronting the American forces were hardly promising. The Japanese forces to be committed were overwhelmingly superior, and the American carrier situation was critical. Lexington had just been sunk in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and in the same engagement Yorktown had sustained damage which made it problematical whether she could get back to Pearl Harbor for repair in time to participate in Midway's defense. Saratoga was still at San Diego, where she had undergone repairs for torpedo damage inflicted by a Japanese submarine on the 11th of January, some 500 miles southwest of Oahu. This left only Hornet and Enterprise, which, after returning from the raid on the Japanese homeland in April, had been ordered out to the southwest Pacific to join in the operations in the Coral Sea. Accordingly, Pacific Fleet Headquarters urgently ordered Task Forces 16, centered around Hornet and Enterprise, and 17, including damaged Yorktown, to return at once to Pearl Harbor. Task Force 16 arrived on the 26th of May, 27th, Japan date, coincident with the sortie of the Nagumo force from the Inland Sea, and Task Force 17 came in early in the afternoon of the following day. Yorktown went immediately into dry dock, where repair crews swung into action in a furious race against time. After refueling and hasty battle preparations, Task Force 16, now commanded by Rear Admiral Raymond Espruance, sortied from Pearl Harbor on the 28th of May. 29th in Japan, just as the Yamamoto and Kondo forces were leaving Hashirajima and headed for the waters northeast of Midway. In addition to Hornet and Enterprise, the task force contained 5 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 9 destroyers. By afternoon of the next day, repairs to Yorktown had miraculously been completed. She then fueled, took on a quickly organized air complement, and sorted in the morning of the 30th of May with 2 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers as Task Force 17, Rear Admiral Frank J. Fletcher in command. These 2 forces were to rendezvous on the 3rd of June, refuel, and then proceed under Fletcher's overall command to a point northeast of Midway by the morning of the next day. In the light of these facts, it is obvious that the second Operation K, on which Combined Fleet had placed so much reliance, would have been of no avail even if it had been carried out. The flying boats, which were to arrive over Pearl Harbor at 1:15 a.m. on the 31st of May, would have been too late to catch either Spruance's or Fletcher's forces. Indeed, execution of the reconnaissance as planned might have had worse results than no reconnaissance at all, for the complete absence of carrier strength at Pearl Harbor might have led Admiral Yamamoto to the mistaken conclusion that the enemy forces were still where they had last been reported, in the southwest Pacific. This delusion would have been furthered by the fact that on the 1st of June, Admiral Yamamoto received from the Naval General Staff in Tokyo a dispatch which gave its considered judgment that an enemy carrier force was still operating in the vicinity of the Solomon Islands. And what about the submarine cordons? As far as can be determined from the American records available to the authors, it appears possible, though by no means certain, that the sortie of the American forces toward Midway might have been detected had the Japanese submarines been on station by the scheduled date of the 2nd of June. By the 4th, however, when they actually did move into position, the enemy carrier groups were to the north of Midway, well beyond the cordon lines, waiting to strike at the flank of the unsuspecting Japanese forces. The trouble, of course, lay in the fact that the entire Japanese invasion plan, including the provisions for the flying boat reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor and the submarine cordons, was based on the assumption that tactical surprise would be achieved and that enemy fleet reaction would not get underway until after the assault on Midway had begun. Combined Fleet planners completely failed to provide for the contingency that the enemy might somehow learn of our intentions in advance and thus be able to deploy his forces for an ambush attack. This failure must be ascribed more than anything else to the arrogant overconfidence engendered by our early victories. We were accustomed to success and so sure of our superior strength that no thought was given to the possibility that things might not go exactly as we had planned. The enemy, too, was confident despite the heavy odds in our favor. In a message to the officers and men of Task Forces 16 and 17 on the eve of their sortie from Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nimitz declared that the coming operation will give you a chance to deal a mighty blow to the enemy. Admiral Spruance on the 3rd of June also issued the following exhortation to his command: an attack for the purpose of capturing Midway is expected. The attacking force may be composed of all combat types, including 4 or 5 carriers, transports and train vessels. If the presence of Task Forces 16 and 17 remains unknown to the enemy, we should be able to make surprise flank attacks on the enemy carriers from a position northeast of Midway. Further operations will be based on the result of these attacks, damage inflicted by Midway forces, and information of enemy movements. The successful conclusion of the operation now commencing will be of great value to our country. Should our carriers become separated during attacks by enemy aircraft, they will endeavour to remain within visual touch. From the first day of June, Midway-based planes patrolled in search of the Japanese invasion forces, covering a semicircle to the west to a radius of 600 miles. Their searches were, of course, hampered by the fog through which the Japanese forces were approaching, but the Americans, whom we believed to be unknowing and unprepared, were in reality apprised of our intentions and standing by in full readiness to attack when the time was right. The curtain was now ready to lift on a battle that would teach us a tragic lesson. The steady rain which had been falling on the main force finally let up on the 3rd of June, Japan, the 4th of June, but the sky still looked sullen and threatening. At 8 a.m., according to plan, Admiral Yamamoto ordered Vice Admiral Takasu's guard force to break off from the main body and proceed to cover the Aleutian's operations. Takasu was to reach a point 500 miles south of Kiska Island by the 6th of June, at which time Admiral Yamamoto's main body would be in its planned position 500 miles farther south. The plan provided for the two forces to rejoin in case of a concerted enemy counterattack in either area. Within an hour after the split-up of the main force, Admiral Yamamoto received a sudden message from Admiral Tanaka's flagship Jintsu, which was in direct escort of the Midway transport convoy, reporting that the convoy had been discovered at 9 a.m. by an enemy search plane over 600 miles west of the target island. Tanaka reported that the enemy flying boat had clung tenaciously to the transports until heavy anti-aircraft fire from Jintsu's companion warships forced it to break off the contact. This development altered the entire aspect of the operation. A part of our forces had now been definitely discovered, and, in all probability, its location had been reported. It was clear that action could be expected, and soon. It came that afternoon when a flight of 9 bomb-laden B-17 aircraft attacked the transport convoy. Fortunately, no hits were scored, and the transports proceeded on their way. Everyone in the convoy breathed a deep sigh of relief. Early in the morning of the 4th, however, other enemy planes came and made a low-level attack. One released a torpedo which hit the bow of Akebono Maru, a tanker at the rear of the transport column. The resulting explosion was powerful enough to kill 11 men and wound 13, but it must have been a partial dud since material damage to the ship was negligible. She was slowed down only momentarily and did not lose her place in the formation. As reports of these developments were flashed to Yamato in rapid succession, signs of concern began to show on the faces of Yamamoto's staff. Just a short time before they had been beaming with optimism over the prospects of the forthcoming battle, but now things were looking less rosy. They had not expected that the transports would be discovered before Nagumo had launched his attack against Midway. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the discovery was contrary to their hopes rather than their expectations. The Midway operation plan had provided for the slow transports to be sent out well ahead of the carrier striking force. Thus, they were especially susceptible of premature discovery by the enemy. One way to avoid this danger would have been to advance the departure of the Nagumo force by 1 day, so that American air strength at Midway could be neutralized before the convoy came within range of the island's search planes. Combined Fleet planners had actually considered this modification and proposed it to Admiral Nagumo, but he had counter-proposed that the departure of the transports be delayed 1 day instead. Admiral Yamamoto rejected this suggestion because the landing had been planned for the last favourable day of the lunar phase and could not be postponed. Hence, with some misgivings, the original plan was adhered to. By the time that detection of the Midway transport convoy had foreshadowed the opening of battle to the south, the Japanese diversionary thrust against the Aleutians was already underway. Rear Admiral Kakuta's second carrier striking force, spearheading the northern thrust, reached its scheduled launching position for the strike on Dutch Harbour in the very early hours of the 3rd of June. Sunrise was at 2:58 a.m., and all preparations to take off were completed 45 minutes earlier to take advantage of the long northern twilight. But the sky, to the disappointment of the crews, did not show first light as expected. On the bridge of flagship, Ryujo, Captain Tadao Kato, in a heavy fur coat, was giving last-minute orders to the attack unit commanders. Not only was the enemy situation unknown, but the flyers, who had never operated in the northern Pacific before, did not even know what sort of weather conditions to expect. Rear Admiral Kakuta anxiously patted the shoulder of the staff aviation officer, Lieutenant Commander Masatake Okumiya, to attract his attention amidst the roar of the plane engines warming up on the flight deck, and inquired what he thought about launching the attack. "Please, sir, we will have to wait a little longer," Okumiya replied. He looked at his watch to find that it was 2:28 a.m., but still the sky had not begun to brighten. Kakuta's senior staff officer, Commander Masanori Odagiri, who had been staring skyward for several minutes, commented that there seemed to be a fog. His observation proved correct and served to explain the continuing darkness. With aircraft carrier Ryujo in the lead, the task force was approaching Dutch Harbour at 22 knots. The mercury stood at 7 degrees below 0 centigrade. Lieutenant Commander Okumiya frowned as he thought of the handicaps under which the attack was being executed. For one thing, the flyers were provided with maps of the Dutch harbour area copied from a chart over 30 years old. The only other guide the Japanese had was a single photograph almost as old as the map. Many shoreline portions of the target island were shown on the map by dotted lines, indicating unsurveyed places. The island was actually unknown to us even in outline. Could the pilots find such a target in bad weather? Failure to locate the targets would mean that there would also be difficulty in getting back to the carriers, and some of the planes might get lost. But this was war. The Japanese forces had come so far for the sake of victory, and there must be no lack of resolution now. Despite the fog, the attack must be launched at the first increase in visibility. Okumiya glanced at the sky with growing impatience. At 2:38 a.m. the shapes of the other ships in the formation began gradually to come into sight. The Admiral seemed anxious to order the planes off immediately, but his staff officers still remained silent. By 2:43 a.m. light carrier Junyo, 1,000 meters distant, became clearly visible, and Okumiya shouted, "Sir, we can launch now." The Admiral nodded and looked toward the signal officer, Lieutenant Commander Okada, who ordered, "Squadrons, take off for attack." Blinker signals flashed from the flagship. Planes rose methodically from the flight decks into the misty haze. From Ryujo, 11 bombers and 6 fighters took off. From Junyo, 12 dive bombers and 6 fighters, all planes under command of Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga. A cloud ceiling of only 500 to 700 feet made formation flight impossible, so the planes headed independently for Dutch Harbour, some 180 miles to the northeast. The day had dawned, but still the sun failed to appear. One of the Ryujo bombers crashed into the icy sea while taking off, but prompt action by an escorting destroyer resulted in the miraculous rescue of the entire crew. The attack planes were barely out of sight when enemy scouts began to fly over the Kakuta force. A flying boat maintained close contact through the fog and dropped bombs before finally withdrawing, but there were no hits. At about 3 a.m. on the morning of the 4th of June, the noisy drone of plane engines warming up roused me from slumber. I got out of bed and attempted to stand, but my legs were still unsteady. The sound of engines alternately hummed and then rose to a whining roar. Akagi was preparing to launch her planes for the attack on Midway. Unable to resist the desire to be topside at takeoff time, I slipped out of the sick bay. The watertight doors of every bulkhead had been closed, leaving only a small manhole in each door open for passage. It was an arduous task to squeeze through these small openings in my weakened condition, and cold sweat soon ran down my forehead. I frequently felt exhausted and dizzy and had to squat on the floor to rest. The passageways were empty. All hands were at their stations. Lights were dimmed for combat condition, and one could see a distance of only a few feet. With great effort, I finally climbed the ladders up to my cabin just below the flight deck, clutching the handrails every step of the way. There I paused long enough to catch my breath and put on a uniform before going onto the flight control post. The first wave attack planes were all lined up on the flight deck. The warm-up was completed, and the roar of the engines subsided. I found Commander Masuda, Air Officer of Akagi, in charge of flight preparations. My colleagues expressed concern over my leaving bed, but they understood when I explained that I could not bear to hear the sound of the engines and remain below in sick bay. I looked up at the dark sky. The dawn still seemed far off. The sky was cloudy, and the weather, while not good, was not bad enough to prevent flying. The sea was calm. I asked Lieutenant Furukawa when sunrise would be. "At 5 a.m., sir," was the reply. "Have search planes already been sent out?" "No, sir. They will be launched at the same time as the first attack wave." "Are we using the single-phase search system?" "Yes, sir, as usual." I recalled the attacks on Colombo and Trincomalee in the Indian Ocean 2 months earlier, when single-phase search had been employed. It had not been a wise tactic in both instances. The searches had spotted enemy surface forces while our attack groups were away hitting the enemy bases, and this had caused our carriers some anxious moments. With this in mind, I inquired what plans had been made for the eventuality that our search planes might sight an enemy fleet during the Midway attack. "No need to worry about that," Lieutenant Commander Murata replied. "After the first attack wave departs, the second wave, consisting of Lieutenant Commander Igusa's dive bombers, my torpedo bombers, and Lieutenant Commander Itaya's Zeros, will be available to attack any enemy surface force that might be discovered." "I see. Well, that's a good team, and we can just hope that the enemy fleet does come out so we can destroy it. What searches are scheduled?" Furukawa explained them to me on the map board. "There are 7 lines extending east and south, with Midway lying within the search arc. We are using 1 plane each from Akagi and Kaga, 2 seaplanes each from Tone and Shikuma, and 1 from Haruna. The search radius is 300 miles for all planes except Haruna's, which is a Type 95 and can do only half that. Although the coverage appeared adequate, I still felt that a 2-phase search would have been wiser. A single-phase search might be sufficient if we wished only to confirm our assumption that no enemy fleet was in the vicinity. However, if we recognized the possibility that this assumption might be wrong, and that an enemy force might be present, our searches should have been such as to assure that we could locate and attack it before it could strike at us. For this purpose, a 2-phase dawn search was the logical answer. As the term indicates, a 2-phase search employs 2 sets of planes which fly the same search lines, with a given time interval between them. Since our planes were not equipped with radar at this time, they were completely reliant on visual observation and could search effectively only by daylight. Consequently, to spot an enemy force as soon as possible after dawn, it was necessary to have 1 set of planes, the first phase, launched in time to reach the end of their search radius as day was breaking. This meant that the areas traversed in darkness on their outbound flight remained unsearched. Hence, a second phase search was required over these same lines by planes taking off about 1 hour later. Men assigned to the first phase of such a search obviously had to be well trained in night flying. Nagumo had such pilots and could have used this method, but it would have required twice as many planes as a single-phase search. Despite the importance of conducting adequate searches, our naval strategists were congenitally reluctant to devote more than a bare minimum of their limited plane strength to such missions. 10% of total strength was all they were willing to spare for search operations, feeling that the rest should be reserved for offensive use. But such overemphasis on offensive strength had proven detrimental to our purposes before this, and it would again. Naturally enough, Admiral Nagumo was eager to devote maximum strength to the Midway attack and did not want to use any more planes for search than seemed absolutely necessary. Since he had no reason to suspect the presence of an enemy force in the area, he was satisfied that a single-phase search was adequate precaution against the unexpected. Search planes from Akagi and Kaga were launched at 4:30 a.m., simultaneously with the departure of the first Midway attack wave. Haruna's seaplane was also catapulted at this time, but the Tona and Chikuma planes, which were covering the center lines of the search pattern, were delayed. Watching the two cruisers, I noticed that the last of their search planes did not get off until just before sunrise, nearly half an hour behind schedule. It was later learned that Tone's planes had been held up by catapult trouble, while one of Chikuma's planes had a balky engine. This last plane was forced to turn back at 6:35 a.m. when the engine trouble recurred, and it ran into foul weather. Although poorly advised, a one-phase search dispatched half an hour before sunrise would still have been helpful if everything had worked out as planned. But the delay in launching Tone's planes sowed a seed which bore fatal fruit for the Japanese in the ensuing naval action. Reviewing the full story of the battle on both sides, we now know that the enemy task force was missed by Chikuma's search plane, which, according to the plan, should have flown directly over it. The enemy force was discovered only when the belated Tone plane, on the line south of the Chikuma plane, was on the dogleg of its search. Had Admiral Nagumo carried out an earlier and more carefully planned two-phase search, had the observer of the Chikuma plane been more watchful on the outward leg of his search, or had the seaplanes been catapulted on schedule, the disaster that followed might have been avoided. The fundamental cause of this failure, again, lay in the Japanese Navy's overemphasis on attack, which resulted in inadequate attention to search and reconnaissance. In both the training and organization of our naval aviators, too much importance and effort were devoted to attack. Reconnaissance was taught only as part of the regular curriculum, and no subsequent special training was given. Also, there were no organic reconnaissance units of any appreciable size in the Japanese Navy. When reconnaissance missions were required, attack planes were usually refitted and assigned to perform them. There were no carrier-borne planes designed solely for search. In the Pearl Harbor attack, every carrier-borne bomber of Nagumo's 6 carriers was assigned to the attack, leaving for search only some 10-odd float planes from the accompanying battleships and cruisers. This had been perhaps the basic reason for Admiral Nagumo's decision to withdraw upon that occasion without exploiting his advantage. At the critical moment, when he had to decide whether to launch another attack on Pearl Harbor, he did not have the vital information which reconnaissance planes could have provided. The Nagumo force continued to suffer from this same lack of aerial reconnaissance in every action that followed. While searching for the British fleet in the Indian Ocean earlier in the year, our search planes often lost their way, and the carriers had to send out radio signals on which they could home. This, however, also alerted the enemy to our position, and the result was an understandable reluctance on the part of Admiral Nagumo and his staff to send out search planes if it could possibly be avoided. This reluctance was still present in the Midway operation and, coupled with the erroneous estimate of the enemy situation, was responsible for the inadequate search dispositions ordered by Admiral Nagumo. One small step toward remedying the search weakness of the Nagumo force had been taken prior to the sortie for Midway,